The first one will be Pilita Zapita, who is in her third or her final year of systematic theology PhD research at King's College London, my own alma mater, where she also works as a graduate teaching assistant. Those of you who are in the back, either please go out and continue talking or pay respect to the speaker that we are introducing. Thank you. Thank you. She's passionate about relationship-centered spirituality and the difference that experientially knowing God's lavish grace and presence makes in a person's posture towards life. Pilira's thesis explores the potentials for Adventism's stance towards gender and race, if the Church were to embrace fully God's Spirit as the spirit of holistic life. Pilira was an English language educator before God invited her on her present journey to first study theology at Newbold before starting her PhD at King's. She's also a guest lecturer in apologetics at Newbold College of Higher Education. And she will speak 25 minutes without questions. If we have at the end a minute or two or three that you can ask questions after the second presenter, we shall utilize that time. But so that you know that it's not that she is cheating the system, we have the agreement. We are aware of it, and so should you be. Her paper is titled Oppressing Women in God's Name. Who has the final say? Please welcome Pilira Zapita.
Good afternoon. Right, my paper is in 3 sections. First of all, I'm going to give a brief definition of religious trauma, an introduction to patriarchy, and a discussion of experiences that sensitized me to my own religious trauma. Second, I will explore 2 options women have in response to trauma. First option, to leave, or secondly, to reframe their spirituality. My analysis will center on embodiment and experience, which are 2 aspects of womanist spirituality, which will lead me to the third section, which is a synthesis of these womanist tenets with decolonial work on pneumatology. As a contemporary theologian engaged with liberative theologies, I ground my research in lived experience and story, both my own and that of other people, some of which is my own way of challenging the separation of the mind from the body and spirit and soul, and integrating reflexivity and acknowledging my own relationship with God within my scholarship. Zilka Spihak-Siljak and Susan Saintville say, religion is a two-edged sword for women. I believe that Christian women have related to and identified with the truth of this statement through the centuries, which I interpret from the lens of religious trauma. I use Laura Anderson's definition that religious trauma is the physical, emotional, or psychological response to religious beliefs or structures that overwhelm our ability to cope and feel safe. Trauma isn't just what happens to us, it's how our nervous system responds. One of the struggles that I've had ever since I was a child, actually, if I'm honest, is patriarchy. And it's a concept that is referred to a lot in women's studies. It refers to the system of oppression, injustice, and exploitation that happens between the sexes. Nicholas Lee describes it as the power of the fathers and the social system in which sexism operates. And that's a system which is organized entirely based on male domination of women. She adds that sexism and androcentrism are seen as twin features of patriarchy, whose consequence is that women are systematically excluded and obliterated from historical traditions and contemporary thought forms, and thus rendered invisible to themselves and to others. For my purposes, I'm including patriarchy as a form of spiritual abuse due to the interpretation of scripture that makes women subjugated. In May 2024, I had an embodied experience, a response to a video that I watched of people who had severe bodily disfigurements. I cried gut-wrenching tears that didn't stop for a while. Now, through my journey with God, I've found that growth is like an onion. It's like peeling it. Each layer reveals more freedom and insight. And similarly, a single experience can have multiple layers of meaning revealed by the Spirit. So after a few weeks of trying to understand from God what my deeply embodied response to the video was all about, the Spirit of God peeled off the first layer of interpretation of that experience to me, revealing to me that God was sharing the tiniest bit of God's heart for the holistic pain that creation goes through. The Spirit of God was sharing her mercy and compassion with me, allowing me to experience in my body the minutest understanding of how God hurts because of the heaviness of sin and its impact on every aspect of life. Now, I wrote about this in one of Newport Press's recent publications, Unveiling the Sacred Resonance. In September 2024, 6 months after the video, I sat through one of the most trauma-inducing and humiliating patriarchal experiences I have ever had in my life. Its effects lasted through December into January. My soul was deeply wounded. My body was utterly depleted. And I felt like my heart was moving from its place all the way sinking to the womb. By January of this year, I was otherwise well and healthy, had developed health conditions that I have since lived with, and in July, my system would not cope anymore. It needed a break. It was during this time I took a break 5 months ago that God started unpeeling another layer of this interpretation to my May 2024 embodied response to the video and the deep tears that shook my whole body. Seeing these bodies and stories, my own body instinctively record moments of marginalization, isolation, frustration, rejection, and confusion, reflecting my personal experiences across physical, emotional, social, spiritual, and geopolitical struggles. I remember sharing one of my friends who is a psychotherapist that I'm suffering from the wound of invisibility. Distorted concepts about God that I had internalized since I was a child played a part in this, and over the years they produced such confusion in me that God and I have never stopped having deep conversations about these issues. On this day, my body remembered, even when I wasn't conscious at all, that it had kept it all. In that quiet space during my interruption from my studies this year, God gently started speaking to me about the depth and breadth of what I was experiencing. You're suffering from religious trauma, Pilira. After 2 weeks of doing almost nothing but sleep, the Spirit gently wooed me, saying, we need to start working on this. At that point, anytime I tried to share my experiences with anyone, I would just cry and cry. But God decided to embrace me in love and tended me that by end August, a combination of factors which I wish I could talk about today, but found me in a much better space. I can talk about it without crying now. I'm now able to name, address, and point to my wounds and walk the journey of healing. What do women do, for example, after the God who calls them to be participants in God life and God mission is used against them? When the very scripture that affirms their worth and place in God's heart is weaponized against them. When the very space where they have encountered the God who sees and knows them, they recognize and use some of their giftedness in kingdom work and purposes, marginalizes them and imply that they imagined, misheard, misunderstood, made up, or misinterpreted their calling. Because as has been said to me, it can never be God who called you, because God never contradicts himself. When religion becomes so toxic, and harmful to their being and their selves when they have been rejected by the system. As I discovered in a conversation with a church leader after I had gone to ask for pastoral work at the conference which paid for my studies but didn't employ me. You are a woman and you are black, so we don't know where to place you. Some churches will not want a black person and others will not want a woman. My body kept what my mind could only deal with superficially because of the pain of that moment, the rejection of my God-given identities as a black woman. What are the options for Christian women once the Spirit has sensitized them to the reality that their religion has been inflicting traumatic experiences on them all along? There are a lot of options women have taken, and I only explored two in this paper. First, live, and second, reframe one's spirituality. In 2023, I attended Gender and Religious Exit, Moving Away from the Faith, my first academic conference addressing women living or changing traditions or religions. As a second-year PhD student, still processing that recent rejection I talked about, I found the research and stories shared there eye-opening, especially regarding issues of gender oppression in religious contexts, including patriarchy, sexism, and various forms of abuse. Option one, leave. The conference reported that there had been an increase in women exiting faith in recent years. Even though it was not only about Christianity, the essence of the issues that drove women to live in their religions were similar to Christianity's, gender-related. Sylvia Rivadosis shared some aspects of a preliminary ethnographic study of women who crossed religions. They left Christianity and went to become nuns in Zen Buddhism. Her study aimed to demonstrate that living a religion can vary based on spiritual flexibility, personal experience, and how much each tradition is experienced. Sometimes there's a clear boundary that marks the exit, making it final, and other times the transition is fluid, allowing return or overlap between beliefs, with exit and entrance occurring simultaneously. There's a lot we can unpack, which I will do in my thesis. But for the purposes of the paper, I want to highlight the fact that the option to leave is very complex and difficult. And the conflictedness that results can never be underestimated. Trauma, religious or otherwise, by its very nature, is like a binding, it's like a chain binding reality that subsumes individualities. So people are not able to be self-actualized and can live as shadows of their selves. So following through the option to live is very bold and courageous. And in another study, Tova Makani Belkin reported how Catholic women left Catholicism for gender-related reasons again, and were drawn to the Baha'i faith's emphasis on gender equality, a denominational move within Christianity. Yet, Catholicism didn't leave them. They ended up in a liminal space, a space many people and people groups living with marginalization can find themselves when a sense of belonging eludes them for so many reasons. For these women, being in the liminal space affected some of their relationships and communities, and they had to renegotiate certain aspects of their identity. Nella van den Braat remarked how, quote, questioning or losing faith or disengaging from a religious community creates relational dynamics, is informed by everyday experiences of being in one's body as well as being in one's social relationships, end quote. And that adds to the complexity of living, because the essence of being human is relational, both with God and with each other. If one doesn't live, there's another option, which is to reframe one's spirituality. Now, I grew up in conservative Malawi and absorbed a lot of patriarchal values that shaped my religion and post-colonial culture. And I deliberately mentioned the post-colonial. After moving away, these beliefs continue to influence me, especially as a Black woman, now facing new intersectional identities in a country where I was an ethnic minority. I had some stirrings from the Spirit with glimpses of what it's like to live a vast life that transcends boundaries, but it will take many years to start even materializing, or even for me to start noticing the systemic restrictions at play, which includes the regulation of my giftedness and the visibility of my Black female body in religious spaces. The journey that God took me on led to this place of theological studies and using what Patrick Johnson calls rereading the Bible as I began the process of unlearning. More than anything, the attention of Elroy, the God who sees me, intrigued me, and it helped me to reframe my perspective to experiential faith as I started to notice that it was even biblical spirituality. The presence of the Spirit speaking, shaping, directing, counseling, agitating, affirming, faithful and powerful, even in my scholarly work. That's what did it for me. The process of deconstructing, though critiqued a lot and feared by many, validated my experiences and allowed me to explore the contested contrast between spirituality and religion. While I remain in religion, could I reframe and see it as a space intended not to develop, defend, and protect power, rigid hierarchies and doctrines, but to facilitate radical encounter and relationality? A space that is not fear-based and threatened by gender difference, but recognizes the imago Dei and diversity of God that is manifested in it. I focus on womanist theology, a liberative theology from Black women, and highlight two aspects of its spirituality: embodiment and experience, that demonstrate how Christian women navigate efforts to silence and subjugate them. Carol P. Christ and Judith Plasko explain that in embodied theology, experiences are the starting point for theological thought, because our philosophical, theological, or even moral perspectives are shaped by our bodies, communities, societies, and histories. And I use the word embodiment as a concept that resists the division of body, mind, soul, and instead adopts the fully holistic view of a person. By experience, a difficult word in Christianity, I'm talking about experiential spirituality, which includes God encounters and how we experience faith in intersection with the other epistemic sources of theology. Many Christians influenced by Eurocentric and Enlightenment thinking equate experience with theological subjectivism, sparking ongoing debate. For example, our former GC president, Ted Wilson, has often warned against experiential spirituality, and yet all theology is inherently contextual. These humanist spirituality tenets offered a framework where I felt seen and heard, conceived from the perceived reality of feminism's racism that focused on the needs of middle-class white women, and Black theology's sexism that concerned itself with Black men. Womanism has a particular orientation and perspective, which Mrs. Smith defines as, quote, unapologetically prioritizes Black women's experiences, voices, traditions, artifacts, and concerns as legitimate sources of dialogue and knowledge, end quote. Epistemology and centering on women's experiences is crucial to womanism and is where its resistance stems from. Stacey M. Floyd calls it an epistemological revolution, whose revolutionaries, Black women scholars, seek to liberate knowledge from its racist and misogynistic subjectivities. For womanist theology, issues of class, gender, and race, and many others are seen as theological problems. And womanism uses Black women's voices among its sources with the intent of interrogating and dismantling the biased ideological foundations of knowing that result in moral, spiritual, and political oppressions. And its use of literary works is also to incorporate the voices of Black and marginalized people, knowing that historically they were neither theologians nor involved in the work of hermeneutics, but they recorded the reflections of their lived reality in literary form, chronicled life in its contradiction with what they were taught about God, so that while humanists read the Bible with a posture of suspicion, they also see the Bible as affirming liberation. How does this speak into religious trauma and the option to remain and reframe one's spirituality? In the Women and Religious Exit conference I mentioned earlier, some women reported being disenchanted by mainstream spirituality and its affective alienation from religion and what they termed feminine spirituality, and the shame and guilt it caused in them. Women therefore can choose to broaden their spirituality beyond the word and rationalistic heaviness and boldly incorporate embodiment and experience as epistemological sources on account of the biblical theology of a God who sees, loves, affirms them, and shares their embodied living experiences with them, however marginalizing to them hegemonic interpretation of spirituality may be. In my work, pneumatology and God's Spirit are at the center of what I do. And I would like to finish going or move towards the end as I demonstrate the intersection of humanism's epistemological revolution with decolonial work of pneumatology. Decoloniality has been a buzzword in the past few years, and it essentially disturbs the assumed primacy of Eurocentric and colonial knowledge systems. In pneumatology, this has called for intercultural approaches to interpreting the Spirit of God, who is no longer called the forgotten God. Modernity introduced subjectivity, experiential focus, and renewed interest in the concept of spirit. However, scholars largely attribute phenomena of spirit forgetfulness to factors such as the this word always catches me, demythologization of the supernatural and the rationalistic tendencies prominent in the 20th century. The Western Church only labeled the spirit linked to spiritual salvation as holy. Any other spirit, pagan and unholy. So any mention of spirit ended up being about discernment of spirit, casting doubt on even genuine spiritual and embodied encounters. Of course, I know that discernment, the moment you talk about spirit, can never be explained away. Sarah Deckett's work sheds more light on decolonial pneumatology. She compares indigenous pneumatologies with her Mennonite Brethren church traditions, which essentially reflects Western Christianity's understanding of the Spirit. She contends that the church has emphasized the comforting aspect of the Spirit to maintain social control, causing the revolutionary nature of the Spirit to be muted and spiritualized by dominant theologies. The elevation of the mind as the paramount epistemic source implied that, as Tony E. Evans says, and I quote, personal experience, storytelling, care and emotions and bodies are considered feminine and unpredictable, and therefore a barrier to producing objective and rational research. Even though subjectivity, experience, emotions, and bodies are integral elements of research and rationality, end quote. Holy wisdom therefore became forgotten and set aside like women and earth. And while all of the roles are not to be understood exclusively as feminine, it can be argued that part of Western Christianity's forgetfulness of the Spirit could have resulted from and been the result of patriarchy and the seeming distrust of the femininity and apparent untamable qualities of the Spirit. So while rationality could inadvertently suggest that patriarchal perspectives are predominantly rational, and while contrasting feminine interpretations may lean towards the emotional, the issue is not about reasonableness or not, but about the elevation of the mind over the emotions and the body. Any spirit experiences that could not be verified somewhat by rationality or the scientific method were and sometimes are still believed to be suspect and maybe even demonic. I would like to argue that that is the broader work that woman's spirituality and its emphasis on embodiment and experience is achieving as part of a broader recovery of silenced and marginalized epistemologies across traditions that affirm the body, experience, and rationality as vital to knowing. As the spirit agitates, recreates, reframes, reconstructs, and empowers and walks with women through the experiences of religious trauma, one cannot help but notice that in these liminal spaces where we find ourselves sometimes, the spirit is at work, disrupting the received oppressive narratives towards others that are more freeing. Whether women can fully recover from religious trauma is uncertain. It depends on factors like nature, severity, and the duration of what they've endured. Triggers may surface unexpectedly as lingering reminders and unacknowledged histories persist. There's an underlying sense that something is amiss, yet attempts to confront it are sometimes met with silence or active suppression. The effects are internalized, tangible, and ever-present. And in my perspective, they usually land on apologetics and theodicy, reflecting the brokenness found in humanity and its systems. There's a tension between the pain of living in a fallen world and glimpses of renewal brought forth by the Spirit, a hope that is present but not fully realized yet. And the same Spirit nurtures resilience, enabling individuals to persist through hardship, rethink their beliefs, reconstruct their identities, choose to live or stay, and resist injustice. This perseverance is carried out in the hope for improvement, even if change doesn't come, in the profound assurance of being held and supported, rooted so deeply by a deeply felt spirituality and connection with God. And I finish with Mercy Aurier's claim: churches may remain patriarchal, but the Spirit of God will have the final say. Thank you.